Welcome to the Access Extension Framework tutorial on the table linker function. So let's have a look at the big picture reason why we use the table linker. So I've put together a sample scenario here where we have a particular database that we've released to 3 different clients, and we're assuming that this is an identical front end and back end that we're distributing. Now you can see that the 3 different clients each store their back end database in different locations. So the problem that we face when we release an upgrade version of the front end is that the front end is initially linked to our development backend, which may be in yet a different place again. So when we distribute that front end to the clients, the links are going to break and they need to be relinked somehow. So a lot of Access developers try to relink the tables into a simulation of the production environment before they distribute the database, which can be quite tricky, and some developers even end up having a whole series of shared drives on their computer which they use to simulate the production environment. So the framework takes a different approach to this, the idea being that we can release one front end and that the upgrade process will take care of the table linking. So what happens is when the upgrade process occurs, it actually removes the existing front end and replaces it with a new one. But during that process, it reads the back end location information out of the previous front end and inserts it into the new one. So when the newly upgraded front end starts up, the first thing it does is relink the tables to the current production location for that site. So if you're using the framework update process to deliver databases to your clients, then mostly the table linker will probably run implicitly as part of that process. But if you've found that you've manually copied a database and the links are broken, then you can also run the table linker explicitly. So now we'll just cover a few of the different modes that the table linker can run in. First, let's have a look at the auto link local mode. So we've got this front end back end Northwind pair, and they're living on location 1 on shared drive F. Now this is the simplest configuration and it's suitable for databases that aren't used very much. A good example of that is, say, a database that is designed to pull information out of a mainframe data file. It's only ever going to be used by one person. So it's really handy for us to be able to package that up basically in a single folder, and it would be great if we could move that around and if it was flexible enough to be able to cope with being moved without breaking. So let's just quickly open this up and have a look. You can see this is just the vanilla Northwind. There's no framework information in there at the moment. And we can quickly have a look in the link table manager. You can see that all these link tables here are linked to the backend database that is sitting in this folder here. Now what we'd like is to be able to move this to another place on the network, say location 2. And we'd like to be able to just go and use this without having to relink the tables manually, which we can do with the table linker. But we have to do that every time the database is moved. So let's move it back to location 1 where the links are valid, and we'll see how the extension framework table manager handles this scenario. So first of all, we're going to import the framework into the database. And you can see tutorial 1 for information on that. And you can see I've entered an application description and code in. It's generated a new GUID for us, and I've saved that information. Now we're just going to link the primary backend. So we don't want to link the framework backend here. We want to go to the shared drive and the location we just saw and link the tables from there. You can tell because I'm doing that, I've already imported the framework into the backend. So we can close and delete this setup form now, and I'd like to just quickly look at how we can list the table information using the command line tools. So we've hit Control G to give us an immediate window. We can hit XF, Command, and T for tables. And if we use the show info command, that will actually give us some information about how our linked tables are linked, where they're linked to. You can see at the moment we've only got this one external database, which is the one we're expecting, the Northwind data backend. All these other tables are local access tables. So let's go to the Control Center now. And we're in the Control Center in the Linked Databases tab. You can see at the moment we don't have a linked database. But we have a handy way of detecting that from the current linked tables. So let's hit this button. And now that's gone and automatically added the information about the linked backend database into the table linker for us. So that tells us where it is, what its name is, and it's defaulted to link local, which just means that it expects the backend database in the same folder as the front end. So let's go have a look at the tables, and you can see it's automatically added all the tables for us against this particular database. If we've got multiple backends, then we can choose which backend a particular table is associated with. So there's one last thing to do before everything springs into action, and that is we've got to put the auto start function into the startup procedure for this database. So let's close out of the control center, and if you go through the Northwind database, you'll find that there is a startup form, and in this startup form, let's have a quick look at the form properties. On open, we've got this event here called open startup, which is in the startup module, and all we really need to do is put the extension framework auto start at the beginning of that code. And that's all it takes to run through the startup functions of the framework, which do things like checking for front-end updates and checking if tables need relinking. So we'll close the database. Let's reopen it. And we'll get that linking warning the first time we start that up, but on subsequent startups, it won't display anything. Now let's have a look at what happens when we close this and move it to the other location. So we get that relink warning, but then it's quite happy to just continue on. And again, if we have a quick look in the link table manager, you'll see that it's all linked up to location 2 automatically. Another way of doing that is we can go and use that xf table information command and show the table information if we want to see where that's linked to, which is location 2. So there's just a couple of things to note here in the control center. One is once this front end is set up here, the easiest way to add new linked tables from the backend database is just simply to add them in here. So we can add a new line down the bottom with the name of our new linked table. One other thing that may not be apparent is that the reason we have this linked table list is some table linkers attempt to just take the existing linked tables in the database and maintain the links. But we've found historically under some circumstances, if a table is dropped and then the relinking to the new location fails, it just ends up with the table being completely dropped from the database. And once the linked table has vanished, there's no way for the linked table manager to realize that that table should be brought back. So this is why we've actually got an explicit table list here. That means the table links can be completely removed from the database, and on startup they'll all be replaced and relinked to the correct location by the table linker. So let's have a look at a few of the other link modes. So in this case, we're going to look at linking a database to a fixed location backend, and that means the backend lives permanently in a particular folder, usually on a shared drive in the case of access. And we're also going to look at how the table linker deals with a Microsoft SQL Server backend. So what I've done here is put the Northwind front end in the My Documents folder, and these are 2 different access backends that we'd like to link to. And we'll also find that there's an SQL Server database on another machine that we would like to link to. So let's go have a look at this front end database. So we've opened that front end and I've imported the framework in, just like I did before, and we're going to link to that primary backend. Now, this time we've got several backends, so we need to make a decision about which one is the primary backend. And in this case, I'm just calling Northwind Data the primary backend. That's where the shared tables for the framework are stored. Okay, so again, we can close and delete the setup form and open the control center. Again, firstly, let's have a look and see what the table information shows us. Now this time we've got a few extra tables here. So most of the tables you can see are in the Northwind Fixed Data Location 1 Northwind Data database. We've got some local tables, and there's a second database here in the same folder in Northwind Data Extra. So the customers table is coming from that database. We've also got the Northwind products table coming from a DSN called Northwind. Now you'll notice if you link a table to an ODBC database that we need to use a machine data source here. and that's an ODBC data source. Now I've just used this function to link that SQL Server table because that's the default way of doing it in Access. But we can also use a DSN-less data connection, and what that means is that the administrator doesn't have to go around and set up this data source on each and every machine that the front end is going to run on. And we'll have a look at that as we're going through the table linking process. Alright, so we're in the control center and we're going to do the same thing that we did before. Okay, so it's giving us a message during the detection process. It's saying that this backend table does not exist in this Northwind Data Extra database. And it's also giving us the same message for the SQL database. The reason for this is that we've imported the framework tables and set up the Northwind Data backend as the primary backend. And while these other backends don't need the full complement of framework tables, they do need one particular table which identifies them to the framework. So let's just open this up and have a quick look. This one's only got the customers table in it at the moment. So the easiest way to get the other table is probably just to import it from the other database. And the table we need is called DBID backend. So let's just import that. But we can't use this table as is. We need to set it up for the different backend. Now we need a new GUID, but we don't have any framework in here, so we can't generate one automatically. Luckily there's a whole heap of sites on the net that will just generate a GUID for you. So let's generate one and paste it in. Okay, and we're going to call this Northwind Data Extra. It doesn't really matter what these are as long as they're descriptive. They just tell you what this is, and as long as they're different from the other backends. So that's all we need to do. So we need to do the same thing to the SQL Server backend. The easiest way to do that is to come here to the Execute Scripts tab in the Control Center. And there's a pre-made script here for you, add MS SQL backend table. Now this script, if we just cut and paste that, we need to replace these two items here with the actual backend name and ID that we want. So other than that, if we cut and paste this into Management Studio and run it against the database, that will create the backend table for us. It is actually possible to execute that against a database if we have the ODBC connection string for it. And once we've got it up and running, that's not too hard to do, but at this point we'll just leave that for later on in the tutorial. So what I'm doing is cutting and pasting this into Management Studio and running that directly. Okay, so now that we've set up those two backends with the ID table, let's go back and redetect. Okay, and this time you'll notice that we have all three backend databases. And because we linked this one first, it's just automatically set that to be the primary. If there's only a single database in the list, then it automatically sets that to be the primary database, which is where the backend tables are stored for the framework. Okay, and just having a look at the table list here, you can see the customers table is in this extra database, and you can see the products table lives in this ODBC backend here. Now there's a lot of extra information when you choose an ODBC backend. All this stuff down here is really just sample information about setting up your DSN-less ODBC or ADO connection strings. So this isn't actually used, this information, it's just a sample for you to cut and paste. So this ODBC connection string here is the one that the built-in Access Table Linker automatically generates for us. One problem with this is that it doesn't include a password, and when the framework starts up, it actually goes and links that ID table just to double check that the backend is actually set up correctly. So a side effect of that is that when we close the database and reopen it, we're going to get this authentication window popping up. So what we really need to do is put a username and password against here if we're not using a trusted connection. So SQL authentication, which is username and password based, can be used in situations where either it's cross-domain, so we can't authenticate with a particular domain, or just in situations like I've got here where I've set up some demo stuff and I don't really want to be bothered putting together a domain. So we have to put in a username and password, but rather than do that with this DSN, what I'm going to do is actually switch to the DSN-less connection at this point. So I'm just cutting and pasting this information, pasting it in here, and we can get rid of this. You'll notice there's no server name in this connection. That's because it uses this Northwind DSN, and inside that data source a lot of the information is stored about the connection. So we'll have to redo some of that. I'll put my server name in, which is testxp/SQL Express. My database is called Northwind. I'm not using my trusted connection. And so you see the comment down here for SQL authentication, use user ID and password rather than trusted connection equals yes. So I'm going to paste that in. So I've entered my username and password. I've also put a space just here so that the line breaks in a convenient point for us, which I'll remove later. Now you'll notice I put @ password. And if we refer to this comment again down here, embed password into connection string as @ password, and the password will be decrypted and inserted before use. So what we can do, rather than actually typing it in free text, which will be stored in a table in the database, we can use this @ password, and then we can enter the password here. Now this is my password. I've called it secret. This is just a demo password. Normally you'd want a strong password there. And what that's done is encrypted it and then stored it in the back end. Now, before it does the connection, it will read and decrypt it. So it's not actually that hard to break. Again, it's a bit like the password for the control center. It's not designed to be high security. It's just really preventing casual use of that password. And of course, the real solution is to use trusted connections and a Windows domain, which is precisely what Microsoft recommends for exactly these reasons. Okay, now we've got this information in here. This is the DSN-less connection, so we don't need our ODBC DSN anymore on the computers that the front end is going to be installed on. Let's close this and have a look. Okay, you can see it's all linking happily there. Our products table is coming in from the SQL Server without any problems, and the configuration's looking good. So before we go on to look at the remaining linking modes, let's just have a quick look at the linker search paths here. Now what I've done is put in both of these paths. So we've got shared Northwind fixed data, location 1 and location 2. And I've put those paths into the search paths in the local section here. Now the search path list at the bottom here, this is in the shared tables, but quite clearly at the point where we want to do a link to the back end, we probably don't have access to the back end, so we don't have access to these search paths. So the point of the bottom one is that when the application starts up, it'll automatically copy anything from this shared back end into its local search path list. So this is just a simple way. If we want to roll out a search path to every computer on the network, we can put it in here, and when they start up, they'll copy it over. So for now, let's just put them in the local table, specifying which back end it is, where we want to look for that. And this is actually unused at the moment, but the idea is to work out what kind of database it is, what kind of function it fulfills. And that's got to be filled in, so you can just use production there. So let's have a look at a couple of different ways that we can set up the table linker. So there's no way to relocate ODBC tables other than actually going into the record and changing this connection string. That's because ODBC databases tend to be pretty static things and they don't shift around much. In the case of an Access database, it's possible that it can move. So let's try, for example, we've got this as assigned, and what we're going to do with the other database that lives in the same location, we're going to choose follow on this one. And what that allows us to do is, rather than setting this one up with a particular location, it just says follow one of the other linked databases. So in this case, we're going to follow the Northwind database. And this just tells it wherever the Northwind data database lives, this one lives in the same location. We'll close this, close everything down and relocate that database, and let's see what happens. Okay, so the first thing that happens is we get a message just telling us we can't link to this backend. It doesn't exist. That's because it's been moved. So the first thing it wants us to do is enter a linker master password, and by default that's just XF, but that can be changed from the control panel. Again, this is just to stop the clients from relinking this without ringing you first and notifying you. So normally you'd give them the password. Okay, and you can see this search path here. So it's looked in the search path and it's located a database. We can say link to this database. This is in one of the two locations we specified to search. The other thing we can do is just browse to a database. So if the database is elsewhere and we may have several different search paths, none of them may be correct, we can actually just go and specify this. Once we hit link to this database, the linker goes ahead and does its thing, and we're in business again. So there's one more setting we haven't tried, that's assigned with user select. We've tried link local, we've seen what follow does. We're not going to cover the assigned fallback local in this tutorial. In fact, it's not supported in the framework at this time. So assigned with user select is the last mode that we're going to check out. You can see when we start up this time, we get exactly the same behavior as before, except that this time we don't need to specify a password to get to this screen. So that really concludes the tutorial. There's just a few closing comments I'd like to make. So the first consideration is we spoke at the beginning of the tutorial about how we use the framework to roll out a single update to a whole bunch of client sites, each possibly with a different backend location. Now, there is one scenario where you don't want the updater to automatically preserve the backend location, and that is when the backend has been moved. That's something that may occur infrequently at particular client sites. So that's why we have this tick box here. You might not have seen this on the page earlier in the tutorial. It's only been recently introduced. But this one suppresses the automatic preservation of backend location during the upgrade process, and it will use whatever is in the linker already. So in that particular situation, you can issue a special upgrade to a particular client with the production backend paths in the table linker. You should only tick this just for that particular release. And we'll just have a look at a few of the settings surrounding the linker in general. So this drop-down chooses which of the three backends is the primary database. And if we look at one of the backends, there's a tick here for temporarily disabling the link manager. So that means you can manage it yourself. If you want to, if the table manager is getting in the way for some reason and you want to manage this using the built-in access linker or some other way, then ticking this gives you the option to achieve that without having to go and delete all the information, which you may find handy later on if you want to turn it back on. The scripting of the backend updates. This is related to the backend upgrade feature, which is covered in a different tutorial. That just switches it on, and the information down here is just the mode that we've chosen and some of the details about the database. You'll notice that the ODBC screen is a little bit different. It's a lot more busy, but as we said before, this is all just sample information down the bottom. So really this just has a connection string instead of a file location. With the ODBC, you can also choose to use ADO scripts. Normally it uses a DAO pass-through script. The advantages or disadvantages of each are fairly technical and probably specific to a particular task, so we won't cover them here. One other thing I'd like to mention is we talked before about being able to execute scripts. So you'll notice in the execute script window, we've now got the three backends that are associated with this front end. And if we choose this one, we can execute a script against it. It's giving us the stored connection string, and it will send that username and password through for us. So this just gives us an easy way of executing scripts from within Access rather than having to have Management Studio installed. And that's the end of the Table Manager tutorial.